On the tourist map, Sri Lanka appears as a green island of fragrant tea, clear seas, and peaceful resorts. But if you ask a Sri Lankan born in the 70s or 80s, they will tell you about a country where the sound of gunfire, explosions, and fear lasted for more than 3 decades. More than 30 years of civil war, tens of thousands of people killed, hundreds of thousands of families forced to leave their homes, and in the minds of many people, all of it gradually became associated with a single name: Velupillai Prabhakaran, the founder and absolute leader of the Tamil Tigers, LTTE. For a part of the Tamil population, he was once called a symbol of resistance. For the rest of the world, he was the architect of suicide bombings, assassinations of heads of state, and a war strategy that dragged his entire community to the brink. In this video, we do not romanticize armed violence. We look straight at the difficult questions from the perspective of someone who loves peace, observing from afar but respecting the pain of the victims. From the real injustices faced by the Tamil people to the choice of taking the path of terrorism, from the dream of a separate state to a lonely death by the edge of a swamp, Prabhakaran's journey shows us how one person can turn the anger of an entire people into a 30-year-long suicide war. If you are interested in conflict case files and want to look at them with a clear-headed perspective, please support the channel by hitting like, leaving a comment, and subscribing. That helps stories as hard to listen to as this one not sink beneath the noise of entertainment. To understand why a single name can be tied to an entire civil war, we have to return to the island itself. Sri Lanka is not only sea and tea. It is a place where 2 main communities share the same cramped space, but carry very different memories and fears. The majority are Sinhala, speaking Sinhala and following Buddhism. The minority are Tamil, speaking Tamil, mostly following Hinduism, concentrated in the north and the east. On paper, they are all citizens of the same country. But in everyday life, that feeling is not always real. After independence, political power fell into the hands of the Sinhala elite. Laws such as the Sinhala Only Act in the mid-1950s prioritized the Sinhala language, pushing Tamil to the margins as a language within the administrative apparatus. For a Tamil student, that was not an abstract concept. It meant a harder university entrance exam, fewer chances to get into university, the feeling of always standing outside the door. For a Tamil family, ethnic violence was not just a line in the newspaper. It meant seasons of riots, news of relatives being attacked, having to quietly pack up belongings and be ready to flee at any moment. From the perspective of the outside world, we can be tempted to simplify everything. One government, one rebel group, one extremist leader. But the reality is much more complicated. At a deeper level, it is the story of people who feel that their voices are not heard, that their fears are not acknowledged. The hard question is, at what point does a real injustice become fertile ground for extremism? At what point does the need to be respected become mixed with anger? And is ultimately seized by someone like Prabhakaran and weaponized into a war that lasts 30 years. If you travel along the northern coast of Sri Lanka to the small town of Velupillai, it is very hard to imagine that this place was once the cradle of one of the most dangerous armed movements in Asia. This is the land of the Tamils, of trading families, fishermen, ordinary civil servants. Velupillai Prabhakaran was born there on November 26, 1954, into a middle-class family, his father working in the administrative sector, his mother taking care of the children and the household. It was not a scene of desperate poverty, not a childhood spent on the streets as many people often imagine about extremists. From very early on, Prabhakaran was not the type of obedient student who was passionate about textbooks. What fascinated him were stories about war, about liberation struggles, about small groups challenging large states. He dropped out of school early, not following the path of civil service exams that his family expected. In the eyes of many Tamil parents at the time, that was a disappointment. But in the eyes of some young people of his generation, it was a sign of someone ready to live differently, ready to confront. What is important is that Prabhakaran grew up in an atmosphere where Tamils constantly heard about the injustices they had to endure. Stories of how it was hard to get a job because they did not speak Sinhala, of files being pushed aside simply because they bore a Tamil surname, of relatives elsewhere being attacked during waves of ethnic violence. Those things did not automatically turn a boy into someone who takes up a gun, but they created a dense emotional undercurrent, where the idea of a land of their own for the Tamils, an independent Tamil Elam, began to have an appeal. Seen from the outside, it is easy for us to say that he could have chosen the path of politics, dialogue, or emigration. But for a young man growing up in Velupillai in the 60s and 70s, the compelling image was not that of a member of parliament in Colombo, but of a commander of a band of fighters, making his own decisions instead of waiting for others to dole out rights. The question is, from where did the dream of a safe homeland for the Tamils gradually slide into the idea of a state ready to kill anyone in its way? And why was someone like Prabhakaran allowed to become the embodiment of that dream? As he entered his 20s, Prabhakaran was no longer the boy who only sat and read about guerrilla warfare. He began to seek out radical Tamil youth groups, people who believed that the moderate Tamil parties had failed. In their eyes, speeches in parliament and petitions sent to Colombo only brought more empty promises. They saw schools restricting admissions, opportunities to enter university narrowing, waves of violence against Tamils flaring up and then subsiding with no one held accountable. For an angry young man in Velupillai, the prevailing feeling was that his father's generation had talked too much and done too little. In the early 1970s, out of that dissatisfaction, Prabhakaran and a few friends formed a small armed group, later known as the Tamil New Tigers. At first, their activities were still scattered, mainly stealing weapons and carrying out small attacks on symbols of the state. But the real turning point came in 1975, when an assassination changed everything. The mayor of Jaffna, Alfred Durayappa, a Tamil seen as too close to the central government, was shot dead on his way to the temple. For many people, it was a shock, because the victim was not a Sinhala politician, but a Tamil. For the first time, a new message was sent out very clearly. In this struggle, the enemy was not only on the other side of the ethnic divide. Anyone labeled a traitor could become a target. From this point on, violence was no longer a desperate reaction, but a calculated tool. In 1976, the Tamil New Tigers were restructured and officially given a new name. The Liberation Tigers of Tamil Elam, LTTE, were born with much clearer ambitions. The goal was no longer to put pressure on the government to make concessions, but to build an independent Tamil Elam state in the north and east. Prabhakaran became the supreme leader, laying the foundations for an armed organization with iron discipline, a creed of secrecy, and absolute loyalty. The LTTE built military, logistical, and propaganda systems and began eliminating rival Tamil groups in order to monopolize the armed voice. On paper, it was a liberation movement, but the way it was designed, with power concentrated in one person and silence imposed on all other voices, raised a difficult question. Was this an effort to reclaim self-determination for the Tamil community, or an effort to completely control that community in the name of a dream that no one dared to question openly. And then, Sri Lanka's history entered a bloody turning point, where the Tamil Tigers not only carried guns, but began shaping the daily lives of hundreds of thousands of people. When speaking of the turning point that made the Tamil Tigers notorious worldwide, many researchers go back to the summer of 1983. In July of that year, after a group led by the LTTE attacked and killed 13 government soldiers, Sri Lanka erupted in large-scale anti-Tamil riots. Hundreds, possibly thousands of Tamils were killed. Homes, shops, and temples were burned to the ground. That event later came to be known as Black July. For many Tamil families, it was the moment they understood that they were no longer safe on the very island where they were born. For people like Prabhakaran, it was proof to claim that the path of the gun was the only one left. Tens of thousands of Tamils left Sri Lanka, forming a diaspora community stretching from Europe and North America to India. In these new communities, the memory of Black July was not only pain, it became a source of political energy. Many began sending money back to the resistance movement, believing they were helping protect their relatives, protect their identity. Only very few of them could see the details on the ground, where the LTTE was increasingly not only fighting the state, but also redefining the entire life of the Tamils themselves in the areas they controlled. From a small guerrilla band, the LTTE gradually turned the northern region and part of the east of Sri Lanka into a state within a state. They built an organized infantry force, far better equipped than other armed groups. They set up bases, divided the area into zones of control, with command and communication systems. At sea, they developed the Sea Tigers, a guerrilla naval force with speedboats and suicide boats, causing significant damage to the government navy. On land, they set up checkpoints, collected taxes, and controlled movement. In parallel with that was a structure bearing the shape of a civilian state. The LTTE established its own courts to hear civil and criminal disputes in the area. They set up a police, issued regulations, printed documents. They intervened in schools, rewrote curricula to glorify martyrs, so that children would grow up in a worldview where the LTTE was the only protective force. For many Tamils living in the area, the daily experience was this. When the central state was absent or seen as hostile, the Tamil Tigers were the only de facto government they dealt with. But that state also had a very clear dark side. To maintain power, the LTTE did not only train fighters, they also built the Black Tigers, a suicide bombing force venerated as an elite unit, given memorial ceremonies, monuments, and rituals. Violence was no longer the last resort. It became the central tool of the organization's identity. Behind those rituals was a cold reality. The more people willing to die, the easier it was for the organization to threaten both the state and their own community. At the center of it all was Prabhakaran. He avoided appearing in public, rarely giving long statements to the international press, not the flamboyant leader type. Instead, his style was discreet, obsessed with discipline, loyalty, and secrecy. Power was tightly concentrated in a very small circle, where every major decision had to go through him. Those who knew the LTTE from the inside describe a structure in which fear and veneration blended together. On the one hand, the leader was seen as the sole protector. On the other, people understood that open dissent could cost them their lives. Other Tamil armed groups, which had once existed alongside the LTTE, were gradually pushed aside and then eliminated through assassinations, kidnappings, and threats. Tamil leaders who chose the path of negotiation and moderation also became targets. when the enemy was not only the government army but also every Tamil voice that did not submit, the LTTE had crossed an important line. They no longer merely represented a community. They claimed ownership of that community. If we look at this from the perspective of a progressive capitalist country, we are used to the idea of freedom being tied to pluralism and open debate. In this context, the question that arises sounds simple but is very difficult. Can a movement that says it fights for freedom truly liberate anyone if the first condition for survival is silence and obedience? How is a state built on the desire to break injustice any different from an oppressive state, if in the end there is only a single voice allowed to be heard? When the Tamil Tigers are mentioned, many Indian and Sri Lankan diplomats do not immediately think of the battlefield, but of two explosions that shook the entire region. In 1991, at an election rally in the town of Sriperumbudur in southern India, a young woman carrying a bouquet walked up to former Prime Minister Rajiv Gandhi. A few seconds later, the bomb strapped to her body exploded, killing him and dozens of people around him. The motive was very clear. Rajiv Gandhi was the one who had sent Indian troops to Sri Lanka as a peacekeeping force, but in the eyes of the LTTE, they were an occupying army. Instead of striking at a military symbol, they chose to strike at a person with a carefully calculated suicide bombing, sending a message to both India and the world. 2 years later, on May 1, 1993, in Colombo, the president of Sri Lanka, Ranasinghe Premadasa, was killed in a similar bombing, right in the middle of a May Day parade. Once again, the attack was attributed to the LTTE. 2 consecutive assassinations targeting the heads of state of 2 different countries cemented the image of the Tamil Tigers in the eyes of the international community. This was no longer a secessionist movement that only struck military targets. This was an organization willing to eliminate any political figure, including those whom the Tamil community had once hoped would bring a solution. The diplomatic consequences were very severe. India, where the Tamil community had once felt considerable sympathy for Sri Lankan Tamils, officially banned the LTTE and designated it a terrorist organization. Many Western countries did the same. Financial support channels and political backing were gradually tightened. In my personal view, this was the moment when a familiar pattern emerged. A movement born out of real injustice, but by choosing to assassinate elected leaders through suicide bombings, they stepped out of the gray zone into a space where international law and public opinion no longer had much debate. But the assassination of heads of state was only part of the story. The darkest side of the LTTE's strategy lay in attacks directed squarely at civilians. On January 31, 1996, a truck loaded with explosives rammed into the Central Bank of Sri Lanka in downtown Colombo. The blast brought down part of the building, destroyed many nearby offices, killed dozens of people, and injured thousands more. The victims were not generals or ministers. They were office workers, currency exchangers, street vendors, people waiting for the bus at the most tragically wrong moment in their lives. In the years that followed, the people of Sri Lanka lived in a quiet fear every time they boarded a bus, went to the market, or got on a train. Train bombings, such as the bombing of a passenger train near Dehiwala, and attacks targeting crowded transport hubs, open-air markets, and shopping districts became a familiar part of the strategy. Militarily, it was a way for a weaker organization to put pressure on the state. But on the human level, those were days when a Sinhala or Tamil mother alike had to ask herself whether letting her child go out to school that day was a gamble. When a bomb explodes in a train carriage, it does not ask what religion the passengers follow, what language they speak, or which side they are on. One of the less frequently mentioned angles, But one that says a great deal about the nature of this war is how the LTTE treated the Muslim community in the north. In 1990, in practice, the LTTE carried out a campaign of ethnic cleansing. Tens of thousands of Muslims were forced to leave areas under Tamil Tiger control, especially around the city of Jaffna. Many families were given very little time, only enough to take some basic belongings, leaving the rest behind. In other places, attacks on mosques during prayer time killed dozens of people. For those victims, the Tamil Tigers were not a force protecting minorities. They were the ones who turned formerly safe neighborhoods into forbidden zones. When a movement claims to represent the oppressed, but then deliberately wipes out the presence of another minority group from the land it controls, we are no longer just talking about war. We are talking about ethnic cleansing. That is the term many human rights reports and researchers have used, regardless of whatever political motives the LTTE put forward. And once again, the first people to pay the price were not generals or negotiators, but vendors, teachers, small shop owners. Those torn from their homes simply because of their names and their religion. On another level, the LTTE's strategy left an even deeper mark on a generation. Many international organizations, including United Nations bodies, documented the Tamil Tigers' recruitment of children into their ranks. There were teenagers taken into training camps, given guns, taught how to lay mines, how to ambush. When the central state could not protect their land, when the Tamil Tigers themselves were the only state their families ever saw, real choices were scarce. In some cases, it was forced recruitment. In others, it was a mixture of community pressure, propaganda, and the fear of being branded a traitor. From all over the world, we can see those images through documentary videos and photographs. A line of skinny teenagers in baggy uniforms, rifles almost longer than their bodies, standing at attention in the sun. A girl of only about 13 or 14, wearing a headband in a ceremony commemorating martyrs. Faces that should have appeared in classrooms and on playgrounds, instead standing in formation. When a movement begins to strap bombs onto children's bodies and calls it noble sacrifice, we are compelled to ask, up to what point? From a moral standpoint, can those holding the guns still be called freedom fighters? And from what point have they become kidnappers of the very future of the community they claim to be protecting? Even so, no war lasts forever. As the early 2000s began, there was a rare moment when people thought that the violence might stop. In 2002, the Sri Lankan government and the LTTE signed a ceasefire agreement under the auspices of Norway. Checkpoints were temporarily reduced. The A9 highway linking north and south was reopened, and the first buses carried Sinhala people up to Jaffna and Tamil people down to Colombo. In some villages, families who had once fled the war began to talk about returning to their old land. For the Tamil diaspora, this was the first time in many years they dared to think about a political solution. But behind that fragile picture of hope, neither side truly laid down its arms. Both the government army and the LTTE continued recruiting, moving weapons around and preparing for the worst-case scenario. From 2004, the cracks became clear. Political assassinations, small clashes, and disputes over who controlled which areas made the ceasefire increasingly symbolic. In 2006, violence flared up again. The new government in Colombo, under Mahinda Rajapaksa, decided to pursue a decisive military solution. The final phase of the war, Elam War IV, began. From a position of controlling large swaths of territory, the LTTE was gradually pushed back into the northeast. Strategic towns fell one after another to the government army. On the map, Those were red arrows steadily moving north. On the ground, they were tens of thousands of civilians caught between two lines of fire, forced to move along with retreating forces or trapped in areas under shelling. The first months of 2009 were a nightmare for Tamils living in the conflict zone. The LTTE did not want civilians to leave the areas it controlled because they were human shields, a source of recruits, and proof to show the world that there was still a community standing behind the movement. Determined to end the war, the Sri Lankan army used increasingly heavy firepower on areas described as safe zones. Human rights organizations and the United Nations later recorded allegations of war crimes against both sides. From the outside, people saw images of makeshift field hospitals, trenches dug as shelters, families clutching a few belongings, not knowing which side was truly safe. In May 2009, the war ended on a narrow strip of land around the Nandikadal Lagoon in Mullaitivu district. This was where the remaining LTTE fighters, their families and civilians were herded into the last corner, with no route of retreat. In the final days, different sources gave different accounts of exactly what happened. But there was one point on which most agreed. The supreme leader of the LTTE, the man who had led the movement for more than 3 decades, died there around May 18, 2009, when the Sri Lankan army declared complete victory. The government quickly released images of a corpse said to be Prabhakaran's as proof that the war had truly ended. In Colombo, fireworks and victory parades followed. Many Sinhala people believed that they had finally moved beyond the specter of terrorism. In Tamil communities, the reaction was more complex. Some felt relief that the era of the Tamil tigers ruling through fear had ended. Others felt only loss, because along with the LTTE, they also lost the dream of a political space where their voices would be heard. From our perspective, the question is not simply who won and who lost. On the battlefield, the Sri Lankan government won. The LTTE was wiped out militarily, and its supreme leader was killed. But what was the price? Tens of thousands of civilians died in the final phase. A community carries a collective wound, both a victim of state violence and a victim of the very organization that claimed to protect them. The suicidal war that Prabhakaran chose did not only take his own life, it also locked up the political future of the Tamil people for many years afterward, in a story that Sri Lanka is still struggling to find a way to retell fairly for all sides. After 2009, the LTTE disintegrated militarily. Its bases were erased from the map, and the Tamil tiger flag no longer appeared openly in northern Sri Lanka. But that does not mean the story ended. In fishing villages, in former refugee camps, in the Tamil diaspora communities in Toronto, London, or Paris, the memories of war are still there. Some families lost loved ones to the bombs of the government army. Other families lost their children because they were recruited by the LTTE. Many Tamils were stuck in the middle, both victims of the state and victims of the very organization that claimed to be protecting them. If we look at it head-on, the painful lesson here is not to deny injustice. The Tamil people truly went through decades of being pushed to the margins, from language policies to opportunities for education and employment. But the path Prabhakaran chose, the path of assassinations, suicide bombings, ethnic cleansing, and child recruitment, shattered the future of the very community he claimed to represent. A movement can start from legitimate demands, but when it uses that pain to justify killing civilians, enforcing silence, and eliminating all other voices, it is no longer liberation. It becomes another prison, only with a different flag and slogan. From the perspective of a peace-loving person, the truly important question is not who we label as hero and who as demon. The question is how to keep very real injustices from being taken over and weaponized by people like Prabhakaran. How to ensure that wounded communities have political, legal, and social channels strong enough before someone steps up and says that the only path left is explosives and rifles. And for us, the ones watching this video, where does the boundary lie between a freedom fighter and a terrorist, when the goal is justice, but the means are indiscriminate violence? If you want to continue delving into stories like this, leave your thoughts below, especially your view on that boundary. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and share the video so that we have more space to calmly look back at extremist organizations. Not to glorify them, but to understand more clearly why they emerge and how to make sure there is no second Prabhakaran.